DiscerningHearts.com presents The Doctors of the Church, the Charism of Wisdom, with Dr. Matthew Bunson. Dr. Bunson serves as the faculty chair of the Catholic Distance University. He is also a senior fellow at the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology. He is the author or co-author of over 45 books, including the Pope Encyclopedia, the Encyclopedia of Catholic History, the Encyclopedia of Saints, the Encyclopedia of U.S. Catholic History, and Pope Francis. Dr. Bunson serves as a senior contributor for EWTN. The Doctors of the Church, the Charism of Wisdom, with Dr. Matthew Bunson. I'm your host, Chris McGregor. Matthew, thank you for joining me.
Wonderful to be with you again, Chris.
We'll be talking about a doctor of the church who, is he considered a part of the patristic tradition, or are we in a different era?
Yeah, we're still dealing with some of the church fathers. I think we'll be looking at, we see the Venerable Bede. We're slowly closing out the era of the church fathers. But St. Isidore is renowned and has been described by historians as sort of the last great scholar of the ancient world. And I think that's a very nice way of putting it. We sometimes overlook St. Isidore in much the same way that we overlook St. Ephrem among the doctors of the church. He was a contemporary of Gregory I the Great and somewhat overshadowed by him. And as we move into the Middle Ages and then beyond, it's easy to overlook him, which would be a terrible mistake, because in his era, not just in Spain, but really across the whole church, there are very few figures who achieved the degree of learning and the reputation for erudition, for learning, than St. Isidore of Seville.
We're talking about a time, he was born in 560 and he lived till about 636.
That's correct, yeah. So this is the time, much as we saw with Gregory I the Great, a very much a post-Roman world. And yet we still had these tenuous connections with the great traditions of classical learning. And that's one of the areas where St. Isidore is especially important, because he helped preserve some of the great learning of the ancient world and hand it off, not just to the immediate decades after his death, but literally centuries. His greatest book, the Etymologies, as an encyclopedia that was in its time the greatest compendium of learning. We're going to talk more about that. It was a textbook used literally for the next 900 years. Mm-hmm. So we begin to appreciate his contributions to learning, but also we need to focus a little bit on his life and his accomplishments as a bishop in a very difficult era of the barbarian invasions were largely at an end, and these great Gothic kingdoms in Spain, especially with the Visigoths, had established themselves. You still had fights that in the rest of the church had been settled centuries before in terms of doctrine. I think, for example, the Arian heresy that was a hallmark of the Visigothic kingdom for many years. You had new threats to the teachings of the church. You also had the need for greater church discipline, especially in this new era of the post-Roman world. So Isidore was part of all of that. And it is for good reason, I think, that he was named a doctor of the church.
As we've spoken often in the past, saints like this are usually found in the womb of a family that has others who are very strong in their Christian faith.
Yes, yeah, that's absolutely true. We know that he was born in Cartagena in Spain to what was called a Hispano-Roman family. In other words, it's a family of Roman origins, but that had long-standing ties by then to the Iberian Peninsula, to what was the one-time Roman province of Hispania. And his parents, his father was certainly Hispano-Roman. His mother was probably, we think, of Gothic or Visigothic origins. And notably, she was probably related to some degree to the Visigoth nobility, perhaps even the royal family. They were converts, and they helped really imbue in Isidore, but also his brothers and sister, a great love of the faith, a great love of the church, so much so that his older brother, Leander, of whom we're going to be talking a lot more, a younger brother named Fulgentius, and then a sister by the name of Florentina, are all honored as saints. So this is quite a family in, as I said, a very troubled part of the history.
Talk to us about how he became a bishop.
Yeah, well, to appreciate Isidore, we can't separate him from his brother, Leander, who was himself the bishop and had a major hand in the education of his brother. Now, when I say a major hand, I mean that Leander undertook to train his brother in especially the area of theology and the faith. We know that he studied probably in the cathedral school of Seville or Sevilla, and it was the first of its kind in the Iberian Peninsula. And it had trained his brother and many others and gave him his first introduction to what became the standards of education going forward in the Middle Ages. He was able to grasp Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. But what's interesting about that is that his brother Leander believed that Isidore needed a firm hand to be educated properly, and was not unwilling to use various forms of corporal punishments in that. And there was one of those turning points in the life of the future saint and doctor of the church, that he was so tired of his brother's harsh methods in education that he actually ran away. And while he was gone, he came upon a rock and water dripping slowly, drop by drop, onto this rock. And he saw himself as the rock and thinking, why can't I master this stuff, this education? But then he appreciated the fact that the water was actually putting holes into the rock. And he understood in that moment that education, spiritual life, these things must be done slowly. And that the softness of the water, seemingly making no impression on the rock, was actually transforming the rock. So slowly but surely, he went back and re-embraced the idea of learning, but understood now that the game plan was to learn slowly, allow it to transform you like water with the rock. And he certainly had the call to the monastic life, to a life of contemplation, and emerged over the next years as a formidable intellect, and seemingly never bore great grudges against his brother for the way he had treated him, because with the death of Leander in 600 or around 601, Isidore was chosen to follow him after years of working with his brother for the betterment of the see.
When you talk about becoming a monk, was he a Benedictine?
Well, it's not clear whether he embraced the monastic life personally or was tied to any specific group. But he thought very highly of the monks, and upon his appointment to the See of Seville, he made it clear that that no one was to interfere with the lives of the monks. And there were the two very memorable things that he decreed. One was that you were not to interfere with the monks, and two, that you would be anathematized if you committed any form of child abuse. So we see his background coming forward here. But as you know, Pope Benedict XVI in his reflections on the doctors of the church and his general audiences really zeroed in on the fact that there was in Isidore, as we have seen with other fathers of the church and other doctors of the church, I think of Augustine, for example, that he wanted to live a life of contemplation, but that he made himself obedient to the will of God, and in fact wrote about that the key to discernment is understanding what God wants for your life and then being obedient in that, so that he gave up the desire for a contemplative life, but instead gave himself to an active life as a bishop, as a shepherd, without losing, though, that internal prayer life, the contemplatio, that gave him such grounding and preparation and strength to be the shepherd that he was to his people.
He could be characterized as a master compiler, couldn't he?
Yes. In his writings, you can see very clearly that this is somebody who was profoundly imbued in the teachings of the ancient world. In fact, he has been criticized over the centuries for being perhaps too taken up with the classical learning. And yet, as a result of that, he left a tremendous legacy of writings, from the history of the Goths to what was called the Chronica Majora, which is a universal history. He wrote a treatise on the doctrine of the Trinity. He wrote a book on natural history called The Nature of Things, as well as things on a treatise on numbers. And then, of course, there was the etymologiae, or the etymologies, that was the first effort by a Christian writer to put together what was called a summa, or a massive compilation of universal knowledge. And its value stems from the fact that in its 20 volumes and 448 separate chapters, this massive compendium of encyclopedic knowledge helped preserve so many quotes and snippets and fragments of classical learning that would have been lost otherwise to history. And the value of this one set of information was such that it remained, as I said at the very beginning, the basic textbook for a host of areas throughout the whole of the Middle Ages and all the way into the Renaissance. And we have Isidore to thank for that. Now, it's been criticized by scholars that there's very little that's original from him, rather that he simply threads together all of these marvelous quotes. That reflected, one, his humility, but two, his belief that he could not say better than the classical writers what he was trying to impart in terms of knowledge. And so the gift was that his own ego did not get in the way of preserving so much information, so many valuable pieces from the ancient world.
He also was a text writer, wasn't he? Besides compiling this information, he would also be responsible for texts.
Yes, well, as I was saying, he wrote a history of the Goths. He wrote a universal history. He wrote on the Trinity, on angels. He wrote a book of natural history that he dedicated to one of the kings of the Visigoths. He wrote a treatise on numbers. He also wrote of the lives of illustrious men, and he wrote on the ecclesiastical offices. So he was a host. He left a massive corpus of writings And some of them were somewhat controversial. I think, for example, of his book on the Catholic faith against the Jews, in which he sort of built on the writings of Augustine of Hippo, and looked at it really from the standpoint of it was kind of a polemic against the rabbis.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been criticized, but you have to, of course, keep it within the context of when he was writing. And seen in that light, you can understand what he was trying to accomplish with the book, although it's, as I said, it's not without controversy.
We'll return in just a moment to The Doctors of the Church, the Charism of Wisdom, with Dr. Matthew Bunson. Discerning Hearts is a spiritual retreat stop for those who travel on the digital sea. Archbishop George Lucas of Omaha has said that Discerning Hearts is a trusted resource for Catholic spirituality and teaching. He supports it as an apostolic for the new evangelization that brings the good news to every corner of the world. Discerning Hearts is an official 501c3 nonprofit apostolate. It creates engaging multimedia specializing in audio productions, known as podcasts and radio broadcasts, faithful to the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church and its rich, authentic spiritual tradition. By visiting the website discerninghearts.com or obtaining the free apps that are available for Android phones, iPhones, and iPads, listeners have available to them the best of teachings from Archbishop George Lucas, Father Timothy Gallagher, Deacon James Keating, Dr. Anthony Lillis, Dr. Matthew Bunson, Monsignor John Esseff, Joseph Pierce, Mike Aquilina, Omar Gutierrez, Teresa Monahan, Sharon Doran, and so many others, as well as all the episodes from Inside the Pages with Chris McGregor. For many people around the world, Discerning Hearts is a daily source of inspiration, spiritual nourishment, and encouragement. The world is looking for answers, for spiritual guidance and authentic discernment, for relationship and community. Please keep our mission in your prayers. And visit discerninghearts.com. We now return to The Doctors of the Church, the Charism of Wisdom, with Dr. Matthew Bunson. So we have someone who has a tremendous intellect and what appears to be a very contemplative spirit. The combination of the two would make him a rich spiritual guide in many ways, wouldn't it?
It was. And that seen in three ways. The first was the care of the people of his see in Seville. But St Isidore's recognition flowing from that of the fact that what was being built, what was slowly coming into being in the Iberian Peninsula was something new. It was the coming together, as happened in Gaul and elsewhere in the one-time lands of the Roman Empire, a new civilization, a new culture. The union of the Roman Hispanic culture, much as his family represented, with the Visigothic nation that had taken over the Iberian Peninsula. The Visigoths were barbarians, and that was a slow process of cultural assimilation, of bringing those two together. And as we have seen elsewhere, the Church had a decisive role in helping bring that about. And Isidore is especially significant for his efforts to end whatever differences there might have been between those two cultural groups, having been raised in a family that brought those two together. And then the second aspect that he accomplished was his efforts at religious union. So in other words, he worked to end the adherence of the Visigoths to the plague of the heresy of Arianism. They had been converted centuries before by an Arian missionary by the name of Ulfilas, and they remained Arians well into their time in Spain. But he was able, patiently and methodically to destroy what was left of the Arian heresy in Spain and to convert the Visigothic kingdom, which had really important long-term ramifications for the life of the faith in Spain, but also for Spain itself. And then there was his role as a bishop, as what was considered the greatest of the bishops in all of Spain, who enjoyed a reputation for holiness and for learning that really shone powerfully at the several synods, one in Seville, and then, of course, the very famous Council of Toledo in 633.
What happened at that council? What was the significance of that particular event?
Yes, well, as I was saying, he wrote a history of the Goths. He wrote a universal history. He wrote on the Trinity, on angels. He wrote a book of natural history that he dedicated to one of the kings of the Visigoths. He wrote a treatise on numbers. He also wrote of the lives of illustrious men, and he wrote on the ecclesiastical offices. So he was a host. He left a massive corpus of writings, and some of them were somewhat controversial. I think, for example, of his book on the Catholic faith against the Jews, in which he sort of built on the writings of Augustine of Hippo, and looked at it really from the standpoint of it was kind of a polemic against the rabbis. And it's been criticized, but you have to, of course, keep it within the context of when he was writing. And seen in that light, you can understand what he was trying to accomplish with the book, although it's, as I said, it's not without controversy.
As you just indicated, the Council of Toledo would be just a mere 3 years before his passing. How did he die? What were the circumstances?
Yeah, his death was, to put it as succinctly as possible, extraordinary. He knew that death was approaching. And this is somebody who'd been the Bishop of Seville for over 3 decades. And as his last days were near, he left his deathbed and he went to perform public mortifications. He donned sackcloth. He received ashes. He gave a very powerful confession. And then he returned to his deathbed, prepared for what followed, showing the way to the people of his diocese, to the whole Church of Spain. As he had shown it the way to live, he was now showing it the way to die. And he died quite literally with a prayer on his lips on April 4th, 636.
I don't think we touched upon why he would be lifted up as a doctor of the Church.
Yes, well, we look at his role in defending the faith as he did against the Arian heresy. We see him as one of the great leaders of his age. He's revered as one of the most learned men of all of Spanish history. And probably the best way of understanding why he was a doctor of the Church was described by the Eighth Council of Toledo that was held in 653, so basically 20 years after the council that he presided over. It called him the extraordinary doctor, the latest ornament of the Church, the most learned man of the latter ages, always to be named with reverence, Isidore. And that was a tribute that was actually re-endorsed by the 15th Council of Toledo, held in 688. So this is a time just after his death, in which the Church in Spain, looking back on his contributions, wanted to do something to honor him. And more than simply being the most learned man of his age, somebody who had such long-standing influence on the life of education throughout the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, He was also known as makes clear, somebody who was, even at the time of his death, viewed as a doctor of learning. And it was for that reason, that legacy, that he was declared a doctor of the church in 1722 by Pope Innocent XIII. Interestingly enough, he was canonized a saint by Pope Clement VIII in 1598. He was also honored by Dante in the Divine Comedy, among the great theologians and doctors of the church.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for bringing to light the life of this, maybe until this point, relatively unknown doctor of the church, would you say?
I think a somewhat overlooked doctor of the church. Two other fun things about Isidore. The first is that there's a great story that as an infant, he was in his crib when a swarm of bees invaded the crib, and they were crawling all over him. And yet the bees lifted off, flew away, but left on his lip, according to pious tradition, a little dab of honey, an indicator that he would be a great spokesperson for the faith in future days. The other is that he is honored for that reason as the patron saint of beekeepers. His symbol is the bee. But when we talk about patron saints, one of the things that listeners may remember is that he was proposed some years back as the patron saint of the internet and the patron saint of computers and computer programmers and computer technicians, in part because of the compendium that he did for learning and his long reputation for such wide-ranging knowledge, such as we find on the internet.
I think there's another reason for that as well. For all of us who have been reluctant to learn the skills needed to operate in the internet, he's a great one to say,
Yes.
to persevere and do it anyway.
Patience will win out, yes.
Very good. Thank you so much, Dr. Matthew Bunson.
Wonderful to be with you.
You've been listening to The Doctors of the Church, the Charism of Wisdom, with Dr. Matthew Bunson. To hear and or to download this episode, along with many others, go to discerninghearts.com. This has been a production of discerninghearts.com. I'm your host, Chris McGregor. Join us next time for The Doctors of the Church, the Charism of Wisdom, with Dr. Matthew Bunson.